Dean Martin was coasting through That's Amore, loose and smiling under the lights, when his eyes dropped to the front row and caught something that didn't belong to the music. A gun resting calmly on a table, not raised, not aimed, just present. A quiet declaration from a man whose name in Las Vegas was never spoken above a whisper. And in that instant, Dean stopped singing while the band kept playing on reflex, the audience frozen in a shared inhale, waiting to see whether the man on stage would retreat or pretend nothing had happened. But instead, watching him do something so audacious it felt unreal as he stepped forward and offered the microphone to danger itself. To make sense of that moment, you have to remember that Las Vegas in 1965 wasn't a playground. It was a machine powered by organized crime, where casinos, hotels, and headline acts all existed at the pleasure of men who lived in shadows, and the Sands Hotel, Dean's home stage, was very much part of that world. The Rat Pack understood these rules well, Sinatra most of all, navigating power with charm and caution, while Dean, shaped by a childhood in Steubenville, Ohio, where illegal gambling and hard men were just part of daily life, understood something else just as deeply. Fear was a currency, and once you spent it, you were broke forever. He knew how mobsters thought, what they were capable of, and how quickly weakness invited ownership. But he also carried something rare, an absolute lack of fear when it came to performing. Not arrogance, not defiance, just a genuine indifference to impressing anyone who didn't deserve it, and that calm had carried him his entire career until it collided head-on with Vincent Antonelli. The collision didn't start on stage. It started days earlier with a knock on Dean's dressing room door and a sharply dressed messenger insisting Antonelli wanted a private meeting, a request Dean dismissed casually, then firmly, then with unmistakable finality, making it clear he didn't take orders delivered secondhand, even as his assistant Jackie and his manager Herman begged him to reconsider, explaining exactly who Vincent was, a feared enforcer with a reputation for violence so extreme it unsettled even his own peers. Dean listened, shrugged, and refused, turning away every messenger, declining every warning, unwilling to apologize for something he hadn't done, unwilling to teach anyone that snapping fingers would make him run. By the night of June 18th, tension hung thick in the sands, whispers spreading, security alert, staff nervous, until Jackie burst in with the final warning that Antonelli had bought out the first 3 rows and brought his men, a message Dean answered by straightening his tie and deciding that if they wanted a show, they'd get one. When he stepped onto the Copa Room stage at 9 sharp and spotted the dark suits and the cold stare waiting for him, he didn't flinch. He sang, joked, teased the silent front row until a slow hand-to-jacket movement and a deliberate throat-cutting gesture drained the room of sound. And that was when Dean stopped everything, smiled, and turned the threat into theater, announcing a break so a gentleman in the front row could express himself, kneeling at the edge of the stage and offering the microphone with a joke that balanced perfectly between charm and challenge. The silence stretched to breaking. Then Vincent Antonelli laughed, not warmly, not kindly, but genuinely, recognizing something he understood when he saw it, a man who wouldn't bend. And in that laugh, the danger dissolved, replaced by respect, as Vincent told Dean to keep singing, and Dean did exactly that, finishing the show as if nothing had happened, while the most dangerous man in the room applauded along with everyone else. The conversation afterward was brief, direct, and final. A misunderstanding cleared, pride acknowledged, respect exchanged, and by morning the story had raced through Las Vegas like wildfire, reshaping how entertainers were seen, no longer just expendable employees, but men who, under the right circumstances, could command respect through sheer composure. Over the years, the tale grew larger than life, embellished with gunfights and brawls that never happened. But the truth was simpler and far more powerful. Dean Martin had faced a killer with nothing but confidence and humor and refused to be intimidated. When Vincent Antonelli was killed years later in a mob dispute, Dean spoke of him without bitterness, calling him tough but fair. And when asked about that night, Dean always downplayed it, insisting he'd merely handled a distraction. But those who were there knew they'd witnessed something rare, a moment when real courage turned a potentially deadly situation into mutual respect, proving that the cool Dean Martin built his career on wasn't an act at all, and that on June 18th, 1965, the King of Cool earned his crown by refusing to bow to anyone. The story didn't stop echoing when the lights went down and the last applause faded, because Las Vegas was a city that fed on stories, and this one had teeth, spreading through cocktail lounges, back hallways, and private offices where power really lived, whispered with a mix of disbelief and admiration. Because in a town built on intimidation, Dean Martin had done the unthinkable and walked straight through it without flinching. And that changed how people looked at him forever, not just as a singer or a movie star or a member of the Rat Pack, but as a man who couldn't be pushed once he decided where he stood, and for the mob that mattered more than talent ever could. The next morning, casino executives who normally treated performers like replaceable parts suddenly spoke about Dean with a new tone, careful, respectful, aware that this was not someone to casually pressure or corner, because if he wouldn't bend for Vincent Antonelli in a packed room with a knife edge hanging in the air, he wouldn't bend for anyone. And that realization quietly shifted the balance between the stage and the back room. Dean himself carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, sleeping late, nursing coffee, joking with friends, because to him the principle was simple and didn't need mythology wrapped around it. You show fear and you lose control of your own life. You show calm and people have to meet you where you stand. And that philosophy guided him long before Las Vegas tried to test it. Frank Sinatra, who understood power and danger as well as anyone in town, shook his head in disbelief when he heard the full story, torn between anger and admiration, knowing how thin the line had been and how lucky Dean was to still be standing, but also knowing deep down that luck had very little to do with it, because men like Antonelli respected nerve more than apologies, and Dean had given him a clear choice without ever raising his voice. Over time, the incident hardened into legend, reshaped by retelling after retelling, some saying Dean stared down a gun, others swearing fists were thrown, but the exaggerations only highlighted how rare the truth was, because no violence ever happened, no threats were shouted, no escape routes planned, just a performer refusing to surrender his stage, and in doing so turning a moment of pure danger into a quiet negotiation conducted through humor, confidence, and unshakable self-possession. That night became a kind of invisible shield around Dean Martin, one that followed him through future shows and future cities, because word traveled fast in those circles and respect once earned tended to stick, and even men who would never call him a friend understood that he was not to be toyed with, not because he was dangerous, but because he was immovable. Years later, when the Sands itself changed hands and Las Vegas began its slow transformation into the polished entertainment capital the world knows today, that story still lingered as a reminder of what the city used to be. A place where courage mattered as much as contracts, and where charisma could diffuse situations guns could not. And for younger performers, it became a kind of unofficial lesson passed down quietly, that the stage was sacred ground, and if you gave it up once, you might never get it back. Dean never framed it as bravery, never claimed it as a defining moment, because in his mind he'd simply refused to let anyone hijack his show or his dignity, and that refusal was woven into everything he did, from the way he sang to the way he joked to the way he lived. Always relaxed, always amused, always just slightly out of reach of anyone trying to control him. When Vincent Antonelli's death made the papers years later, Dean's response was measured and almost gentle, acknowledging the complexity of a man who lived by a code, even if that code was brutal. And that quiet acknowledgement said more about Dean's character than any dramatic retelling ever could, because he understood that respect didn't mean approval, it meant recognition of strength on both sides. Looking back now, what makes that night so compelling isn't the threat or the danger, it's the clarity of the moment, the way one decision defined everything that followed. Because Dean Martin could have chosen the easy path at any point, could have taken the meeting, offered an apology, avoided confrontation entirely, and no one would have blamed him. But he understood something fundamental about power, that once you hand it over willingly, it rarely comes back. And so he chose to stand exactly where he was and let the world adjust around him.